twice, so I think we'll skip the introductions. This is one of those very important things about the role of cow's milk in growth in children, especially in India where cow's milk is used a lot for children. So over to you, Professor Kim.
Thank you very much, and welcome back from coffee break. I will talk about the role of cow's milk in growth of children, and I will focus on those about 12 months. I will not talk about infancy. And I will talk about what happens in low, middle, and high-income countries. Milk for infants or for calves is a food to support offspring during a period of immaturity, vulnerability, and high growth velocity. So it does from the start have something to do with growth. First, something about cow's milk, dairy, and linear growth. We made several years ago a review where we said that the strongest evidence that cow's milk stimulates linear growth come from observational and intervention studies in low-income countries. But there are also many observational studies from well-nourished populations that show an association between milk intake and linear growth, and I'll come into some of those. And they suggest that milk has a specific growth-stimulating effect, even if your nutrient intake is adequate. There are a few other reviews, or there are many other reviews. There's one by Draw and Allen that also include children and adolescents from high-income countries. And there's a recent one, 2017, from Jakubowicz Gavan and his co-workers on milk and growth, and also bone health and weight gain. One of the systematic reviews is a meta-analysis of controlled trials. There are quite some intervention studies, and you can see that the summary here is a positive effect, and actually the conclusion was pretty precise, saying 245 milliliter milk daily results in an increase of 0.4 centimeter per year. I'm not sure exactly which age group that is, but there are other studies as well. There's an interesting one from Grasgruber and his team, a study of male height in 105 countries, where they looked at the association between some social indicators and some national dairy intake data. And they found strong correlation between many of these indicators and height. And high on the list here with a correlation coefficient of 0.80 is milk products, but higher than that is Human Development Index. So there's a lot of, this is not causality, so there's a lot of interference with all kinds of indicators in your country, but you can see that total protein, animal protein, and then urbanization comes in. And he then combined some highly correlated proteins, and he took milk products, eggs, pork, beef, meat, and potatoes. I don't know why potatoes was included here. But then the overall correlation coefficient was 0.85, and you can see a strong correlation. But of course, this is not causal. We did, several years ago, an analysis of conscript height, soldier height, in European countries, and could demonstrate how it increased from 1960s up to 1990 in most of the countries. One of the conclusions was that in the Scandinavian countries and in Holland, from 1985, there was no further increments. The male adult height was about 180 centimeters. And looking at some national data, there's also a tendency that those countries with the highest adult height, the tallest men, have a higher milk intake. Again, observational. There's one here, a study from East Asian countries. It's Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, looking at the consumption and milk and the association with nutritional status. And they had more than 12,000 children from 1 to 12 years. And they found that dairy consumption per day, they divided into less than 1 or more than 2. And there was a positive or a negative association with stunting and with underweight, not with thinness and overweight. And again, they did control for some socioeconomic factors. But again, there might be other indicators that they haven't controlled for sufficiently. They also mentioned that lactose intolerance, it was discussed briefly. They said no issue in younger children, and they can tolerate some dairy and yogurt. And I'll come back to the lactose issue later on. There's also some on cow's milk allergy and height. There are several studies have shown that children with cow's milk allergy are shorter. So what could the causes be for that? It could be no milk, but it could also be reduced diversity of the diet. It could be that they have more gastrointestinal inflammation, EED-like inflammation, or it could be asthma medication, steroids, perhaps that reduce their height. But I'll show you 2 studies here. One from Japan, where they took them in for a oral food challenge, and then they looked at the weight gain about the following year. And if you were tolerated milk allergy at this and started to get milk again, you had a significant increase in height. That's the middle panel. But if you had food allergy other than milk, or if you had persistent milk allergy and didn't continue with milk, there was no increase. But you can still see there's a huge variation between the children, and it's not a very marked increase, but still significant if you tolerated milk. There is also another study here looking at reduced final heights and inadequate nutritional intake in cow's milk allergic children. That is observational young adults with and without cow's milk allergy. And those with cow's milk allergy were significantly shorter. They were 0.6 C-scores shorter, and the control were not different. There was a difference of 4 centimeters, but again, there could be many causes for that, in addition to no milk. There was also less with stunted children in those getting milk. Age of puberty. That is influencing adult stature. Is intake of milk associated with age at puberty? There are some studies looking at that. There's Wiley looked at it in Haynes in 2 papers. One of them is here. Some evidence that greater milk intake is associated with an increased risk of early menarche, that is lower than 12 years. Another study here from Tehran, the risk of earlier menarche, less than 12 years, was higher in girls with higher intakes of milk. And one from India, they looked at age of menarche. The mean was 13.7 years, and the consumption of dairy product, meat, fish, and eggs were not associated with age at puberty. And another one in Chilean girls that actually showed the opposite. Low-fat dairy, low-fat milk, and yogurt intakes were positively associated with a later age at menarche. So difficult to conclude for that, but if there is an effect, of course, that would influence adult height later on. Here there is a meta-analysis of children and adolescents aged 6 to 18 years, randomized controlled trial. They had interventions more than 12 weeks. There were 17 trials. In this intervention, they had many different interventions. They had milk from 190 to 1,000 milliliter per day, so there was a huge heterogeneity. The intervention could also be daring, providing 600 to 1,200 milligram of calcium because they wanted to look at calcium intake. And most of the controls were habitual diet in those populations. They had no effect on height. They were 9 centimeters taller, but it was not at all significant. What they found was an increase in weight, 480 grams more, significant increase in lean mass, a decrease in fat mass, but that was not significant. And then, of course, there's a decrease in fat percentage. And their conclusion was children and adolescents aged 6 to 18 months consuming milk products are more likely to achieve a lean body phenotype. So there's some indication that not only linear growth, but also lean mass is stimulated by milk, but not very strong evidence. The NHANES, again, Wiley, 2 studies in American Journal of Human Biology, positive relation between milk intake and linear growth in early childhood and adolescence, but not during middle childhood. So the conclusion is that during periods of high growth velocity, there is an effect of milk. They also showed, or she showed, that young children in the highest milk intake quartiles had higher body mass index. And then there was no measurements of body composition, so it could still be because of lean mass. Low milk intake can then increase the risk of stunting, and I think that's quite strong evidence we have. Stunting is also associated with decreased child development, decreased work capacity later in life, and decreased risk of chronic diseases. There's a lot of studies supporting this. And then the causation between stunting and these important outcomes is discussed, and there's a very recent paper, 2019, by Leroy and Frangillo, discussing this, that we perhaps have to look more on the outcome that are important than stunting by itself. And I've just mentioned this paper, Mark Mannery and his group, showing that milk powder added to a school milk increases cognitive test scores in Ghanaian children. And I'm sure that he would come more into that during his presentation later today. So, strong evidence that cow's milk stimulate linear growth. It might also have an effect on lean body mass. What are the mechanisms? We made a study some years ago where we want to make a proof of concept looking at IGF-1 and insulin, which are growth factors in young children. And we gave young boys a very high intake of milk, but only for 1 week, 1.5 liters of skimmed milk, or 250 grams of meat. We thought we couldn't convince girls to take this. But only 1 week, and then we could show a significant increase in IGF-1 and also a significant increase, quite a high increase in insulin, and we was a little surprised that it was so high. This was fasting insulin. No effect of meat in this study. We then made another study where we took whey equivalent to 1.5 liters of skimmed milk daily, or casein equivalent to 1.5 liters of skimmed milk, and randomized them. And this was a study for 2 weeks. And we could show that IGF-1 was stimulated by casein, and insulin was stimulated by whey. So both of these might have an influence on growth. So we made this graph that cow's milk, and I'll come back to which factors in cow's milk might stimulate growth. And perhaps mainly whey stimulate insulin and casein IGF-1. And of course, then it's interfering with the hormone IGF-1 growth axis with a negative feedback if you have a nutritional stimulation of IGF-1. There is then a very interesting recent study from India, from Pune, with also Professor Jainik as the last author, They looked at 2-year-old children. It was observational, 44% still breastfed, 26% vegetarian. And they divided milk intake into 3 groups, less than 1 serving, 1 to 2, and more than 2. And they could show that IGF-1 was significantly associated. The more milk, the higher IGF-1. But also length was positively associated. The more milk, the taller you were. Interestingly, the IGF-1 values they had was significantly lower than what we had in Denmark. I'm not sure if part of this could be because of the methods, but again, they had higher values in girls. It was not significant in the Pune study, and we had significantly higher values in girls, which is seen in most other studies. So the tendency is that girls have higher IGF-1 values. We have published a study which was close to the one in Pune, where we at 2-year-olds looked at the association between milk intake and height, and milk intake and IGF-1, and we found positive association with both in a Danish populations where we did not think that they had any nutrient deficiencies, so supporting that there is an extra effect on growth on milk, even in a well-nourished population. So is the IGF-1 axis programmed? There are some indications for that. We had a cohort study where we measured IGF-1 at 9 months, at 17 years, and found this pretty strong negative correlation, suggesting that if you have high IGF-1 early on, you will get lower later on, and the opposite. We are not sure when the shift happens and what's the role of milk and protein intake on that. But Richard Martin and his co-workers has made from a former Nestlé Nutrition Institute workshop a paper where they looked at the programming of the IGF-1 axis. And they found that if you have high milk intake in infancy, you have higher IGF-1, but it seems like it's lower later on. And in childhood, if you have higher there, it seems also to be lower in adulthood. But in adulthood, there is an association between milk intake and IGF-1. So they speculate and base it on 5 different studies that there is such a programming. And what that means in what we are discussing here is not so clear, but there's something happening. Effect on milk on other outcomes. This is long-term association between dairy consumption and risk of childhood obesity. A systematic review, 10 studies, mean age 7.4 years. Children in the highest versus the lowest dairy group, they had 38% less likely to have overweight obesity. With each dairy serving, the percent body fat was reduced by 0.6%, and the risk of overweight obesity was 13% lower. So these are older children. This is a review by Draw and Lindsay Allen, looking at health outcomes and looked at body composition and energy balance. Emerging evidence that dairy proteins better support muscle protein synthesis than plant foods. Leucine might play a central role. And also, they looked at bone mineralization, and with a high calcium intake, that might also stimulate bone mineralization. And they looked at blood pressure. Children with a higher dairy intakes had lower blood pressure later in childhood. So, we're talking about if milk is affecting adult height. What does adult height mean in relation to other health outcomes, chronic diseases? This is a very interesting review, I think, from PLOS ONE, Savada, almost 500,000 individuals. Average follow-up is 12.5 years, and they divided height into quintiles. And if you compare the highest with the lowest, you had an increased cancer mortality if you were very tall. And if you were not so tall, you had a higher circulatory disease mortality. So underlining, there's problems for everyone, even the tall ones and the shorter ones. This is a study from the Nurses' Health Study, 52,000 individuals. Healthy aging here was defined at 3 of 11 major chronic diseases, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and several others. No reported impairment of subjective memory, physical impairment, or mental health limitations. They found an 80% decrease in the odds of healthy aging per standard deviation increase in height. So that was a negative association with height, adjusted for demographic and lifestyle factors. But there's still hope for the tall ones, as a prudent diet rich in fruit and vegetables might modify the relation, and they found this interaction. But again, a complex picture. What are the growth components in milk? We have talked about protein, high quality score, branched chain amino acid, leucine might play an important role, minerals, especially phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and zinc, and lactose, I'll come back to that. Also bioactive peptides. And if you look at foods for treating or preventing malnutrition, you might have less antinutrients if dairy is replaced by plant protein. This is a review we did recently. The challenge with dairy is the high cost, and Mark Mannery will talk about that we need cost effectiveness analysis and assessments. What about lactose? We have also had a small narrative review on that. And this is a photograph I took in Ethiopia in 1985, where they sent out skimmed milk powder, but it was lactose hydrolyzed because it came from Finland, and they are very afraid of lactose, and they thought malnourished children should have less lactose. But it's a much expensive procedure to do. Lactose persistent phenotype is very different in different parts of the world. Where we are now, there is a lower rate of lactose persistent phenotypes, more in Southeast Asia. And in these populations, you will have problems with drinking a lot of milk if you are getting an older child. But generally, no symptoms before 3 to 4 years. What are the effects of the lactose? The potential negative effects is lactose intolerance, and that might be more if you are malnourished. The potential positive effects are prebiotic effects, increased mineral absorption, improved growth, and I'll show you some pig studies. It's speculative if that's the case for children, and improved energy density and palatability of the products. These are some data from pig studies where they, for many years, have used lactose to improve pig growth. And even in some of these papers, they discuss if the effect on growth is due to whey protein or to lactose. I think a discussion is if lactose have a positive effect on growth in undernourished children. There's a huge difference in lactose content in different products for children. But I think you should remember the whole time that human milk has the highest content, about 40% of the energy content. Minerals for growth, I mentioned it briefly, potassium, phosphorus, zinc, and we had made a study from Uganda that low serum phosphate predicts death in malnourished children. So phosphate is important as a mineral supplement for these or as a part of the foods they get. Are there negative effects of a high milk intake? Yes, I think so. A high intake between 1 and 3 years may increase the risk of later overweight and obesity. There's quite a lot of data that a high protein intake during this age group will increase the risk of obesity later on. It will reduce the diversity of the diet. It may replace breast milk. Now I'm again only talking about 12 months, but in many low-income countries, breast milk is an important food during the second year of life as well, where it has protective effects, and there it might replace breast milk. And we have heard already that it can increase the risk of iron deficiency if you drink a lot of cow's milk. So we see in Denmark milkaholics, children drinking far too much milk, being admitted at hospital with severe anemia. So, are there children in India who drink too much milk? I think that's a question for discussion. I took these 2 photographs from Chennai, an advertisement promoting a dairy product, showing that the mother knows that the child will get higher if she gets that product, and also some chai preparation. What are the recommendations on milk and dairy intake? Center of Disease Control say that from 12 to 24 months, between 470 and 710 milliliter per day is okay. Government of Canada the upper limit is 750 milliliter per day. Some East Asian countries say 500 to 750 milliliter per day. In Australia, they said limit it to 500 milliliter. And in Denmark, we say the recommended intake is okay if it's about 350, but don't give more than 500 milliliter. If you give 750 milliliter to a 1-year-old child, it's about 55% of the energy intake. It gives 2.5 gram protein per kilo, more than double what they need, their requirement. The WHO have guidelines for the non-breastfed child, 6 to 24 months. We mentioned this in the discussion yesterday. They say if other animal foods are eaten regularly, 200 to 400 milliliters per day would be all right. If no other animal foods are eaten, 300 to 500 milliliters per day. An acceptable milk source, they mentioned a range here. WHO came out with a recommendation some years ago on foods for moderate acute malnutrition. And they said it's important that the protein quality is high, more than 70% PD-CAS. And again, Mark Mannery will come into that in the discussion. But they also said that the inclusion of milk improves the amino acid profile and has a specific stimulating effect on linear growth and IGF-1. So there's no strict recommendation on using milk, but they mentioned that it could be effective. And they asked for additional research, and that has happened since then. From a recent paper here, they have summarized what World Food Programs say on ready-to-use supplementary foods, and they said more than 1/3 of the protein by weight for dried skim milk, and for super cereals, more than 8 gram dried skim milk. And they have a jointly WHO, World Food Program, United Nations, UNICEF, and some other committees saying that for SAM, you need dairy products, and it should be more than 50% of the protein. There's also a recent paper here with André Briand as the first author, Mark Golden, and Mark Mannery is also a member of this, saying high milk content of ready-to-use food makes it an expensive product. Using lower quantities of it seems desirable, and again ask for more research to find alternatives because it's expensive. So my conclusions: convincing evidence that milk and dairy stimulate linear growth also in well-nourished population. Suggestive evidence that it also stimulates lean mass. Populations with high intake are taller as adults. We can then discuss how important it is to be taller. Adult stature is positively associated with cancer mortality and negatively with cardiovascular mortality. The effect of growth is through a stimulation of IGF-1. There is a programming of IGF-1, but the implication of that programming for health, we don't know in detail. A very high intake, especially the first years of life, increased risk of obesity, reduced dietary diversity, and increased risk of iron deficiency. And milk intake in children should not be above 500 milliliters. That's my recommendation. Milk and dairy products are effective but expensive ingredients in food for treating MAM and SAM. The main growth components are protein, growth minerals, and lactose. UN organizations recommend that dairy protein should be part of food for treating SAM. For MAM, we should still discuss it. It's important with high protein quality. Again, Mark will come back to that. So there's a current research interest in this, and we will have that later on. Thank you very much. This is a photo from Chennai I took some years ago.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for that extraordinarily invigorating lecture. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Can we ask for the question? Yes?
I am Dr. Sagar Lad from Pune. I just want to ask that, yeah, it is known that cow milk produces iron deficiency anemia. And as per recommendation, 500 ml cow milk is okay, but is there a definite guideline that after how much amount of milk that precipitate the iron deficiency anemia? And my second question is that you said the infant with the cow milk allergies, they are generally stunted and wasted. So usually if there is a no cow milk allergy, then it is a growth promoting factor. So is it true?
So the first one on iron, I think it depends very much on the amount. That's why I think it's important to reduce the amount of cow's milk and also to add other iron-rich foods like fish and meat in the complementary feeding. And we heard a lot about that in the discussion yesterday. The second was on
cow's milk allergy.
Cow's milk allergy. And what was the question?
Whether the cow milk allergy it causes stunting in the children which are especially in infantile period. So if there is a no stunting, if there is a no cow milk allergy, does it promote the growth in the child?
No, I think the association we see, as tried to show, was with lower height in those with cow milk allergy. We are not sure about the reason. It could be different. Less milk, but also there could be inflammation, subclinical inflammation, gastrointestinal inflammation, which could also affect growth. So I'm not saying that it's because of the milk.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for your excellent lecture. So I have a question that you have correlated height with the milk intake. But height has got multiple dimensions, particularly other confabulating factors, especially the genetic potentials. So one big cause of the stunting is the familial short stature, where we have to calculate the mid-parenteral height, and by which we can understand how much will be the genetic potential and ultimate height will be achieved. If these factors are not excluded from the study, you cannot conclude that there is a linear relationship with the height as well as the milk intake.
There are a lot of potential confounders in these studies, and I agree that genetic factors are important. But again, if you looked at the graph I had with conscript height, it was increasing for the last decades in Europe. So there is factors that are really stronger than the genetic factors. But of course, we should take, and in clinical pediatrics, you take the parent height into consideration if you look at stunting. So again, it's complex. And I'm not saying that that milk is the most important factor, but I think I'm convinced that there is some effect.
Sir, another thing is that you have shown that the high level of the branchial amino acids, leucine, but they have got some negative effect for insulin resistance. That's why the insulin level is also high.
That might be. I'm not deep into the amino acids. I think Mark Mannery might talk about that. He has studied that more when in trying to optimize products for malnutrition. But I mean, that's complex as well. And the branched amino acids and leucine, how it interacts.
Isoleucine and valine.
Yes. I can't discuss it in detail.
Natalia?
Natalia Wageman, Switzerland. I just would like to make sure that we are talking about the same. So as we know all that for infant during the first year of life and better second year of life, the main milk is a breast milk. So whatever we are talking now about milk and implication on the growth and other factors, that's not for infants, but for children. And let's discuss this period that we don't make any misunderstanding about when we are asking questions and what Professor Michaelsen is replying. Thank you.
I think Professor Kim made it very clear in the beginning that he is not talking about infants. Gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Dr. Shomodi Pishash. I would draw the attention to a very important study that they are doing in King's College London. I had a personal opportunity to interact with the principal investigator. It is called the EAT study, where they are introducing cow milks very early, like as early as 3 months of age, and they have seen there is a decrease in sensitization to cow's milk protein. So one important reason of avoiding cow's milk in early infancy is, obviously we know, is cow's milk allergy. So, and since they have found very promising results by introducing cow's milk protein early, do you also think that introducing cow's milk early can reduce the sensitization to cow's milk protein?
I think you should not, during infancy, you should not introduce it if you are breastfeeding, and definitely not do it just to reduce the risk of allergy later on. I think the last years we have seen a lot of studies suggesting that you shouldn't be afraid of introducing foods like fish and meat early on, because the risk of allergy later on is not increased. It might even be not increase, it might be decrease. But I don't think you should introduce milk early just because of that reason.
If I might make a comment, I think you have to take a cost-benefit ratio here. The advantage of decreasing cow's milk allergy versus the risk of causing either infection, as has been shown by the Probit and the Honduras studies, or by causing iron deficiency states, which I think are much more significant rather than decreasing this. As Professor Kim said, there have been studies, a lot of studies recently on peanut allergy and early introduction of peanuts, even keeping cats at home to prevent cat dander allergy and so forth. But this is a risk-benefit analysis. I think the risk of giving cow's milk is far higher than, I mean, this is my personal opinion, it will be far higher than the risk of, than the benefit of decreasing cow's milk allergy. Sir?
Matt Silver, The Gambia. Thanks very much, Kim. Speaking to this issue of establishing the causal link between milk consumption and growth, and also thinking of that interesting study you presented on the lactose intolerant children, I'm wondering if there's been any Mendelian randomization studies looking at genetic polymorphisms driving lactose intolerance to establish that causal link.
I am not sure. I just read a review that Andrew made where he discussed that. Isn't that right? Where you...
Well, we covered aspects of the genetic origins and selection of the lactose persistence genes, of which there are several variants. I think Matt's suggestion is extremely good. It would be actually very tractable to do that because there's such a high prevalence of the genes, in certain populations, as you showed on your global distribution map. So I don't know if it's been done, Matt, but I think it would be a really good target for Mendelian randomization.
I agree, certainly. I don't know of any studies.
Maybe we should just explain for people in the audience who may not know about Mendelian randomization.
That's a good idea.
This is the suggestion that if you have a gene that would predispose you to drinking or not drinking milk, then that would give you an unbiased test of whether drinking or not drinking milk or alcohol or whatever was on the causal pathway. Because normally, as Kim demonstrated, so many of these studies are confounded. People who drink milk also do very many different things, and they're generally of a different social class. So to try and overcome that confounding, there's a process known as this Mendelian randomization studies, and as Matt suggested, that could be a very tractable approach.
Dr. Sridhar?
I just wanted to make a comment on that insulin-like growth factor that we were talking so much about. Now, we do know that the levels of IGF-1 are very low in the first few years. They peak up at puberty, and again, there is a somatopause when you reach your 60 and 70. And when colostrum was marketed in our country in a very big way, there was a lot of debate whether it should be given, not given. Why is it that colostrum comes only in the initial few days? And one of the discussion was on the IGF and malignancy, because it does work through a number of AKT signaling pathways, DNA synthesis, and milk is a known activator of the mTOR pathway. So there is even a linkage to prostate cancer, there is a linkage to inflammatory conditions like acne, there is so much. And you had a lot of slides on milk and linear growth, which was initially there, and later on there was nothing much to suggest growth, probably because there was already insulin-like growth factor. And are we middling with the physiological usual spurts that are happening in our body? Because insulin-like growth factor is one parameter that we usually assess in growth hormone deficiencies, in dwarfism, because it's relatively constant, one of the easy ways of doing an endocrine study. So I was just thinking loud about it. And second, that since we are entering into an era of pharmacogenomics and phenotypic medicine, and there is so much of talk on genetics, we as Indians are different. So do we have, like the doctor from Pune asked you, are we more milk tolerant, so it's okay for us to exceed that 500 ml? Or we should have a separate definition for a milkaholic?
I want to discuss with you if you have children young children who are drinking far too much milk, because I think milk is very popular here. Coming back to the IGF-1, I think it's a fascinating field, and I know also the mTOR papers suggesting that that's a link to some of the negative effects on the long run. But another interesting thing about IGF-1 is that it's very much lower in breastfed infants compared to formula-fed infants. And that might be, and the programming effect of that is not very clear, but it's touched by Richard Martin in his paper.
And the second thing that I was thinking loud is, we as a country, we have so much of fever and diarrhea in the initial few years of life, a high protein load and the amount of load on the liver and the kidney in the metabolism of proteins. Are we pushing kids into hypernatremic states?
Again, I think it's important to limit the intake of cow's milk. I mean, it has many positive effects, but you shouldn't get too much. And if you are getting, I don't know how common it is here that you have children with very high milk intakes, because I see advertisements here in India supporting that it's very healthy with milk and you will get taller, and you also have the religious aspects of it. But I'm sure you could elaborate more on that than I can.
Thank you.
Yes, madam. I think we will take 3 more questions and then we run out of time.
Hello. Yes, you said of early menarche in girls. So early menarche does it not limit the height of the girls? So the linear increase, which we had because of increased milk consumption, doesn't it get nullified?
Does it what? Sorry.
Since the menarche is pushed early
yes.
in girls, so does it not limit the height? Because once the menarche starts, the gain of height is very less.
That's
is
right.
My first question.
That's right. So I mean,
so
there's a lot
really
of conflicting data here.
Yeah.
I think pushing menarche is negative. And again, we have also discussed in low-income countries or in countries with malnutrition, if you push early growth in girls, it might lead to early menarche, and that will have later.
Loss of
so it's, I mean, it's like everything in nutrition, it's a balance. Yeah. And I don't think we should push. I mean, I appreciate that it's very important that also for breastfeeding that women have optimal nutritional status.
Another thing, sir?
Sorry?
Milk we are consuming here, particularly in vegans, milk is not only,
it's not a what?
Milk is consumed. Apart from that, yogurt and other cottage cheese. So the milk consumption is much more than only drinking milk, cow's milk. In different forms, milk is consumed here.
Yeah. Not
only as a
very
drink,
nice,
but as also protein intake. It
yes.
may be the only protein intake apart from pulses in many parts of India.
Yes, you have a lot of nice chai, and you have yogurts and many foods with milk, many desserts with milk also.
Yes, yes, yes.
So
yes, sir.
Well, thank you for the interesting talk. Well, what I could understand is that as per the guidance of WHO, the breast milk baby should be fed on the breast milk till 2 years or beyond. But you are mentioning that beyond 1 year, milk should be given, limiting up to 500 ml. Is it necessary that babies children who are beyond 1 year of age should be given additional milk? What the effects what you are saying on insulin growth factors and insulin? Is it recommended to give milk to those babies who are breastfed?
I think if you are breastfed, it might not be necessary. Of course, it's difficult to estimate the amount of breast milk you are getting during the second year of life. But I think, as I said, it could also be negative if you push milk, and you might reduce breast feeding during that period. But again, did that answer your question?
You have been mentioning that beyond 1 year of age,
yes.
The introduction of the cow's milk will help in increasing the height and also have the effect on insulin growth factors.
I think it's after 1 year of life, if you are not breastfed, I think it's an important part of nutrition. I'm sure we will hear more about that by Müller, talking about vegan diet and the potential problems.
I think Professor Kim, what he was asking was, in a baby who is getting breast milk between the ages of 1 and 2 years,
yes.
Is it necessary to add cow's milk?
I don't think it is, if it's breastfed, and also again, for the, I mean, if you're continuous breastfed, we have had so much discussion about iron that it's important that you introduce iron-rich foods. And if you're breastfed, I don't think it's necessary with cow's milk.
Any more, Madam?
Yeah, this is a comment and a question as well. I know it's always confusing when we talk about stunting and long-term consequences, and I'd like to clarify, when we talk about the long-term consequences of stunting, we're really referring to the process of stunting early in life when there is significant growth. And so that's important, whereas your discussion is children still grow, so if you want to sort of draw a line and say half your growth happens in the first 3 years of life, there's still the other half. And the variability and the determinants for the second half is much, much more complex, the genetics, etc. So in that context, as we transition, are you aware of any trials that look, say, as catch-up growth? Because those are things which people are interested. Okay, you've missed that window of opportunity for whatever reason. What do we know about, diet in children 3 to 6, and what's the, there's that trade-off, and I was very interested, especially, with the concern with the diabetes epidemic and the NCD.
We have, there's a lot of literature saying that we should focus on the first 1,000 days, but Andrew Prentice have made a review saying that it's not too late, that you can still do something with stunting afterwards. Isn't that right?
You're quite right to say that we've written that, and particularly that noting that in many low-income countries, a very slow, long pubertal growth spurt can be associated with a great deal of recovery, maybe as much as 1 standard deviation Z-score recovery. My problem with this is that I kind of fear to tread here as an intervention. Indeed, there's a great deal of discussion about this and interventions being planned, because there is evidence, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, that children who have translocated to Western populations through adoption and go to a better diet, puberty starts younger, and you indicated something about this, and their final adult height is considerably smaller.
Yes.
So I think we don't yet understand the dynamics of that, and so although we've published that, within our group we're not progressing towards any intervention studies. Indeed, a couple of interventions we did in the past have shown an adverse effect, that actually linear height, adult height, was smaller in groups who received a calcium supplement, for instance.
Because puberty came earlier?
Indeed, yeah, they went into their spurt earlier and it stopped earlier, sooner.
But I think the whole discussion about how important is it to be tall is interesting. I mean, there are many associations, but what are the mechanisms and how important is that?
May I maybe just respond to that? Because I think what is important for us to remember is that humans are designed to grow slowly. This is really a massive evolutionary adaptation, and some of you may have seen a slide I show of the growth of my grandson versus the growth of my daughter's puppies. You know, dogs grow 20 times as fast as humans. It is perfectly easy to grow miles faster, and the calf that you showed in your first slide grows even faster than that.
That's why there's so much protein and minerals in cow's milk.
So growing fast is not difficult to achieve, but over evolutionary time, humans have evolved to grow very slowly. And I think it's important that we remember that, and there are very good reasons why we've done that, basically to give time to grow and then train our very complex brain. And I think we have a tendency to far too easily forget that. So I would like to remind people here to keep that in mind when you're thinking about, you know, trying to maximize the growth of a child.
So it's just like what we saw decades ago with the preterm infants, that we shouldn't push their growth too much. It should be, again, a balance.
And I also thought about the endocrine disruptors that we never talk about, the environmental endocrine disruptors, which are playing a major role in,
Definitely.
the endocrine.
That's important too.
I think we are out of time. So thank you, Professor Kim, for this lovely lecture. And if there are any further questions, I'm sure we can interact with Professor Kim during the lunch break. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.